Poverty, so much more than no money, no problems, by Shwari Vamagiri.
and Mentrol.
So, how should we define poverty? Poverty refers to the failure of basic capabilities, which is displayed through the form of reaching or not reaching a minimally acceptable level of resources. Now, we are going to be defining poverty through the capabilities approach. Because of its emphasis on the freedom to choose over not only the achievement of well-being, over the most basic standard of living, and escaping extreme deprivation. Here we refer to Sen's classic example of starving versus fasting. The person who is starving, they do not have the freedom in order to meet their basic needs of food and nutrition, while the person who is fasting is making that freedom of choice in order to not eat food. Another example would be basic clothing versus the lack of specific clothing. The person on the left who is trying to decide between two choices of clothing is using the preference of styling choices and the freedom to choose, versus the clothes shown on the right, where people are lacking their basic need of clothing and they do not have the freedom to choose.
So, how exactly does the capabilities approach work? To understand how the capability approach measures poverty and well being, we can turn to Sen's argument. He believes that we need to focus on functions. Here, functionings refers to the various things a person manages to do or be in their life. Consequently, Sen states that capabilities reflect the effective freedom of an individual to choose different combinations of functionings. Sen's argument puts less of an emphasis on the exact commodities that are required to achieve well-being and advocates for dignity in the right to choose, in the right to exercise agency in choosing functions. This accounts for interpersonal and intersocial variations of what functions are essential to lead an equal life. Here, in quantifying capabilities, a question of which functions to choose is raised. We will be considering two perspectives. First, Sen's argument stresses plurality in choosing an individual's functionings relative to their concerns and values. Inherently, the list of functions are open. An example might be that a person may consider the inclusion in the LGBTQ community as a necessary function. With the example of Dorothy Allison, her inability to openly express her sexuality as a consequence of poverty led to the loss of her well being and dignity, whereas another person might not consider this necessary for their well being. Our second approach in the selection of functions is Nussbaum's. Her standardized method introduces a list of 10 essential functions that are universal and applicable to all, which we will get to later on in the presentation.
Now, dissecting Nussbaum's capability approach, we look into three different categories: internal, combined, and basic capabilities. First, looking at internal capabilities, Nussbaum refers to these as the trained or developed traits or abilities that have been developed within the interactions of social, economic, political, and familial environments. These are the fluid and dynamic states of a person, such as their personality, intelligence, emotional capabilities, health, and bodily fitness. Now, a person might have these internal capabilities, such as the freedom of speech, but may not be able to act on these internal capabilities due to societal restrictions, such as not having the freedom of speech, but having the education of these rights. And just because someone may have the internal capabilities of being intelligent, they may not have access to resources such as education or other resources to enhance their physical and emotional health or the support of their family. The next is basic capabilities, which are the innate faculties of a person that make later development and training for other capabilities possible. This is the example of prenatal care and maternal nutrition, which enable someone to be a better mother and function better as a parent. And lastly, we look at combined capabilities, which are not just the abilities one person has, but also the freedoms and opportunities that are created by a combination of these personal abilities and interact with the political, social, and economic environments. These substantial freedoms are a combination of these capabilities. And now we will go into Nussbaum's 10 central capabilities and briefly mention them.
Martha Nussbaum has developed one of the more systematic capability theories. She outlines 10 universal central capabilities that every individual must have to lead a good life. uh, life, bodily health, bodily integrity, sense, imagination, and thought, emotion,
As well as practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, control over one's environment, as well as architectonic role.
Martha Nussbaum then introduces us to the concept of a tragic choice. She outlines that a tragic choice involves having to forego one of the 10 central capabilities for another. A hypothetical could be how a person might have to choose between paying for rent, which is a bodily health capabilities, or paying for their education, which is a sense, imagination, and thought. Within these capabilities, Nussbaum also mentions that there are two types of functionings. Fertile functioning, a function that tends to promote or accentuate other related capabilities. An example of this would be how education, sense, imagination, and thought plays a fertile role and opens up several opportunities to meet other capabilities, such as bodily health, affiliation, and control over environment. Next, we move on to corrosive functioning. Here, this refers to a deprivation that has a large effect on other areas of life. This can be observed through Allison's story, where her subjection to domestic violence affected her ability to achieve other central capabilities, such as emotional well being, health, and affiliation.
Now, you might ask, if we have these capabilities approach, why isn't it the primary measure? Well, there are other measures of poverty that do exist, and we will delve into some of their disadvantages and why we still believe that the capabilities approach is the more prominent and superior of them all. First, we go into the SPM, which is based on the amount of financial resources that are used to achieve a standard of well being, such as the cash income plus the non cash benefits and the near cash benefits, which are taken into account in order to assess someone's poverty threshold. But what this SPM does not take into account is the relativity of location, and it also only is restricted to measuring legal and blood related family members and does not account for cohabiting couples, which may not have been an existing phenomenon back in the 60s when this SPM was formed, but now in modern age we have to take into account these groups of people, otherwise they will be left out and the poverty measures will not be accurate. The next is the OPM, which takes into account cash income, and it is based on Molly Orshansky's 3 times the cost of the minimum food diet in 1963 and is adjusted for inflation and family size. But it does not take into account non-discretionary items or near cash or non-cash benefits, and it also doesn't include cohabiting couples. The next is absolute versus relative. Looking at the absolute measure, it is developed in reference to the basic psychological needs where the measure does not change as the standards of living do change, based on Iceland's definition. The resources that it takes into account are cash income, but the main disadvantage is that even though standards of living are constantly changing throughout generations and the years, the measure does not change along with these changes in standards of living. The next is the relative poverty measure, which is the comparative economic deprivation, according to Iceland, that is relative to the society's standing on economic, social, and cultural development. It is also based on the cash income from the household, but the threshold is based on 60% of the median income. But the disadvantage to this is that on some level, if society is affluent and you fall below the 60%, you may be categorized as being in poverty, quote unquote, but you may be having all your basic needs met, which means that it's a very not accurate measure for people who fall just below the 60% median income threshold. Next is the HDI measure, which is the measure of health, education, and income. It takes into account average life expectancy, educated years, and expected years in school, as well as an income index. But the main disadvantage to this is how the certain characteristics, such as life expectancy, are related to poverty, the connection between the two. For example, someone who lives a shorter life may be wealthy, but may have a chronic illness, which would lower their HDI index, versus someone who has been poor their entire life, but has had no chronic illness and they've lived longer than the richer person. This will change the HDI index based on the different circumstances of these factors. It also assigns equal weight to all the factors it considers, which may in practicality not actually be of equal value. The next is the extreme poverty measure, which is not an accurate measure because it is based on people who live on less than $2 a day. But this is not helpful because in modern day poverty, people do not live on less than $2 a day and actually does not capture all the poverty that people do experience. The next is consumption. Consumption is measured through the family's consumption of goods and is related to the poverty threshold rather than being based on income. But the main disadvantage to this is that some people may consume little by choice, and through these choices they may be categorized as in poverty, whereas in reality they really aren't. And the last one we'll be going into is social exclusion, which is the shorthand term for what people can experience when um, having a combination of linked problems, such as being excluded from communities or society of agencies of different people, such as being excluded from employers, schools, government services. And the main disadvantage to this is that this measure is very challenging and flawed because they indicate the proportion of people who are poor, but not the shortfalls that the poor have, as well as it lacks the complete depth of the poverty that people experience.
Next, we will dive into the arguments for and against capabilities approach. As for the arguments for the capabilities approach, with the capabilities approach, there is a focus on freedom of an individual to choose over only the achievement of well being. This highlights the importance the approach gives to dignity. This aligns with the belief that poverty is also a lack of dignity and its corresponding social exclusions that leads to inequality of opportunities in society, which is why a focus on dignity is essential. As Nussbaum states, it will support agency rather than infantilizing individuals and treating them as passive receivers of aid, this thus preserving their dignity and right to a choice. Another argument for the capabilities approach is its relativity. The approach accounts for both interpersonal and social variations of poverty. As Sen states that regardless of the method, we cannot rule out social variations of poverty as terrible deprivation can vary from place to place. Relativity is important to capture a more accurate picture of what it means to be in poverty, as it is a shifting, evolving term. Uh, Another point could be that the capabilities approach is a more complex and extensive approach. The capability measures accounts for factors that are often overlooked by other measures of poverty, factors that are often unquantifiable but still essential to measuring poverty. One of many being the interpersonal variations in what capabilities are necessary for a person's well being creates a focus on the individual. This is necessary because an individual's ability to convert the resources into valuable functions may vary greatly. Nussbaum's definition of capability itself mentions that it reflects an individual's effective freedom instead of a group. This is why it is important to focus on the individual in the sense that it paints the most accurate and extensive picture of poverty. Uh, the capabilities approach could also be critical in policy decisions. Nussbaum's theory of capability and its explanation of internal capabilities may also be very useful for prioritizing policy choices in regards to alleviating poverty. Her concept of fertile functions creates an understanding of which functions can create exponential growth in several other capabilities. Therefore, by identifying these fertile functions, policymakers can more effectively prioritize their efforts and allocate resources to reduce poverty. This brings us back to our example of education as a fertile function. Similarly, an understanding of corrosive functions could also help policymakers identify and avoid certain deprivations that leads to a large decrease in capabilities. Next, we will dive into the arguments against capabilities. Uh, the capabilities approach is centered around an assessment of how individuals from all walks of life fare in society, which can be very difficult information to collect. Considering the difficulty in calculating people's real choice sets or complex capabilities like to appear in public without shame or to form relationships with others. This correlates to Sen's theory of defining necessary functions, as we mentioned earlier on in this presentation. One of its major flaws in plurality. If every individual's essential functionings are relative, this makes quantifying the amount of people who are unable to have basic capabilities met exponentially harder. However, we believe that Martha Nussbaum's theory of the 10 central capabilities could address this issue of complexity. Her argument partially accounts for the difficulties in calculating capabilities under Sen's plurality method, as she introduces a standardized list of capabilities which would make it relatively less complex to measure. Although this is not a solution to the complexities in measuring poverty with the capabilities approach, or could even be considered crude, Nussbaum argues that certain capabilities are simply measured more qualitatively than quantitatively.
Next, we move on to Rector's argument. To summarize Rector's argument, it's that there are discrepancies in the American people's perception of poverty and what actual living standards under poverty are in the United States. He accuses the media and the Census Poverty Report of misleading the general public with inaccurate information. He believes that the poverty threshold is overestimated and leads to an exaggeration of the poverty rate, which causes ineffective poverty policies and a misallocation of the government's resources.
We believe that this argument does have merits in that it addresses a lot of the issues with the government's poverty threshold and the census poverty rate's lack of information on actual living standards. However, we disagree with this contempt towards the government's poverty threshold being inflated. We believe that the rise in the threshold is owing to relative needs rising in the US. It is necessary to be relative in order to ensure dignity and equal opportunities and avoid social exclusion. A higher threshold would also help in addressing income inequality. Despite Rector's distaste of the inclusion of inequality in the poverty threshold, we think that it is necessary as it is a major cause of poverty.
Primarily, the capabilities approach is better at addressing poverty and inequality than Rector's argument, because in his argument he states that families who have air conditioning and refrigerators and some basic amenities are not poor, quote unquote. He is not taking into account, though, the sacrifices that have been made to have access to those amenities. For example, in order to have air conditioning for a family, someone might have to give up their health care or not be able to afford child care for their kids. Rector's argument does not go beyond the scope of assessing whether families have materials and does not take into account the sacrifices that they make in order to meet having access to these materials. Hence, this is why the capabilities approach would be a better poverty measure versus Rector's, as it is based on the functionings a person needs in order to enable their utmost well-being, as opposed to being solely based on having certain commodities.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel